I'm Mehdi Hasan.
And I'm Owen Jones.
We are Two Outspoken. Welcome back for another episode. Owen, good to see you. How is life?
Honestly, Mehdi, this is always the highlight for me. Every 2 weeks, I'm just counting down the days, hours, minutes. How are you? How's it going? Give me a praise.
Why were you late for this if you were counting down minutes?
Because, Mehdi, technology is not always on our side. And I think our viewers deserve only the best sound quality. And the cable wasn't working. So I just thought worth delaying.
Maybe it was Mossad.
As ever, I always presume it's Mossad. If in doubt, CIA, Mossad.
Or MI6, the various world's three-letter acronym soup.
All of which are my employers as well.
That's true. No, I work for the CIA. A lot of people think I work for the CIA. So when you just say that, you can clip that now. You can clip it, just a little bit of me. I work for the CIA. Some clever editing. Let's talk about the big story of the week, because you and I have been both outraged about a story that went down, but also attacked for our reaction to it. I saw FoxNews.com did a story in which they included me in people who are apparently upset that Israel rescued/freed 4 Israeli hostages from Hamas captivity in Gaza. Are we upset that 4 hostages are freed?
Funny enough, not actually, Mehdi. I think the consistency we've always had is throughout this, the moral consistency, moral clarity we've always had, is that all human life has the same innate equal worth. I know it's a completely crazy, extreme view to have, that you don't, for example, consider someone's life to be worth more than another by virtue of their ethnicity. That is, in common parlance, known as racism. Just FYI, in case people weren't aware what racism actually boils down to. What we objected to was the mass slaughter of Palestinians. And when we talk about mass slaughter, this has been one long massacre with lots of sub-massacres. I mean, it's been this bloodbath. Now, what happened this Saturday was the Israeli state, having refused to accept a hostage deal, because we all agree the taking of hostages is a grave war crime. There was no defense for taking hostages, no civilians in any circumstances. We want all of those hostages back to their loved ones. Of course we do. As well as, we would say, the Palestinian prisoners, who Gideon Levy, the brilliant Israeli journalist, correctly says are Israel's hostages, including kids who've been physically and sexually abused, according to, for example, Save the Children. There was a deal as we know, there was a precedent. You have a ceasefire, you have a prisoner exchange, and that's how we get them released. Israel has killed more hostages of its own hostages by military means than it's rescued by military means. What we object to is the price of rescuing these 4 hostages, who could have been released in another way without slaughtering lots of people, was perhaps 300 Palestinians being slaughtered. Palestinians, each of those Palestinians in their life having the same innate worth as those Israeli hostages.
So just to be clear, you mentioned same worth. Just for people watching, the Palestinian Health Ministry, Hamas controlled, but the numbers have been pretty reliable, both in this conflict and previous conflicts, say 274 Palestinians were killed on Saturday in the Nusayrat refugee camp as part of this Israeli raid, which freed 4 hostages, 3 men, 1 woman, in 2 locations. That is roughly 70 dead Palestinians per hostage freed. And by the way, we should point out, the health ministry says about half of them were women and children. So even if you assume that every man killed was a Hamas militant, which is what some people want us to believe, even then you've got around 100 women and children killed, which again is about 25 women and children dead per Israeli freed. That is a pretty insane ratio when you think about it from a purely moral point of view.
I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, because I got Dogpile too. I was on some TV compilation. And, you know, the best kind of response from these people were, oh, so you oppose an operation, this military operation, do you? Yes, is the straightforward answer. I don't accept the mass slaughter of Palestinians. Look, I'll give you an example. David Lammy, who's the shadow foreign secretary, that means he's set to be Labour's foreign secretary when Labour win a landslide victory, which will happen thanks to the Conservatives' self-destruction. In a few weeks, he tweeted out, we've both met David Lammy many a times. I've done events with David Lammy. He tweeted, it's now 245 days since October 7th when these hostages were kidnapped for the Nova News Festival by Hamas terrorists. Their rescue is a glimmer of hope in the darkness. How is it possible? If you were to ask David Lammy, I know, having met him many times, I've spoken to him many times. If I asked him, do you think Palestinians have the same, civilians have the same innate worth as an Israeli civilian? He would say, of course I do. How would it be possible to reconcile that statement with that tweet? Because when he says a glimmer of hope in the darkness, what he didn't even mention, he didn't even think to mention, was the mass slaughter of men, women, and children, not even including those, including little kids who have lost their arms and legs and been severely injured.
We're not counting the 600, 700. We don't know how many people were injured. The numbers are crazy. But in the US too, Owen, it wasn't just in the UK. It was in France. It was in the Western media across the board. It was Joe Biden. It was his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. It was Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State. All of their initial responses was just to say, yay, 4 people freed, not even an acknowledgement of the Palestinians killed. And by the way, the Israelis are saying that these people were killed because Hamas opened fire and Israelis responded. And, it's a classic crossfire. But actually, the Israeli media has been reporting that what happened was when they went to rescue the 3 men from the second location, they managed to get Noah Argamani, the very famous female hostage, freed without much issue. When they went to get the 3 men, the Israeli media is reporting that they got into a fight, and the Israeli Air Force decided to distract people by just bombing nearby targets. So we don't even know what they bombed. They just bombed a refugee camp, and that's why children end up in hospitals. So it was almost them clearing a path. Again, no value for human life. Just get rid of some Palestinians, make some noise, bomb some shit, which is the Israeli way forward. It's just not legal. Indiscriminate bombing, which Joe Biden's phrase, indiscriminate bombing, is a war crime under international law. Dressing up as civilians or aid workers, driving in a civilian truck, which is what the Israelis are reportedly have done, is a war crime. Perfidy, I think it's called, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Strange word, but it means basically you can't dress up as a protected group, a refugee, a doctor, a civilian, an aid worker, and then open fire on people. It's a war crime. So the Israelis did this in the middle of the day. They bombed a refugee marketplace. They killed hundreds of people. Whether you don't accept the 274, okay, just accept the 100. The 90, okay, let's say they only killed 40 people. That's still 10 Palestinian civilians. If you assume only 40 civilians were killed, which is a ridiculously low number, that's 10 for every Israeli. And you've made this point. We need to put politicians and journalists on the record to say, what do you think is the correct ratio? What is your upper or lower limit?
Well, I think it's clear they don't have one. Look, I've not been surprised, if you like, given, I know, as we both know, we've worked in the Western media for a long time. I understand the dynamics at play. I understand the sheer level of racism which defines the Western media and its coverage. But I was never, ever, ever during this horror show stopped being shocked by just how blatant the total dehumanization of the Palestinians has been, just how profound it's been, the lack of any pretense at all that Palestinian life has any value or any meaning whatsoever. Yes. And it's not subtle. And you get these occasional, this example where it's just in Technicolor. And, you get dogpiled by all these people saying, oh, look how triggered they are because some Israeli hostages got rescued, as though we're the psychopaths, as though we're the ones who are, we're upset because 4 innocent people have been rescued. I was haunted. I don't know about you, but during the 7th of October attacks, when Noah Armagani was, I think I pronounced the name right, was kidnapped. And I remember, screaming for life on a motorcycle. That haunted me, that image, for many weeks. It was grim. And of course, we want that all of those hostages reunited with their families have gone through unimaginable horror and anguish. The fact is, the people who've defended this massacre, and we should just refer, overall, it was a massacre, that should be the main detail of what we report in terms of what happened, which is what you will do if you value Palestinian human life at all. These are people who are on the record supporting war crimes. And you mentioned perfidy and the way they're going about it. There's no pretense. And, it's this moral contamination where, because normally you'll get a pretense of people trying to look civilized and humane, but they're just saying it. They're just coming out and saying it.
What's interesting, Owen, is that, okay, some of the leaders in the West have belatedly gone, oh, yes, there was a lot of civilian casualties. But there's been a bunch of people, mainly on the right, but not just on the right, who've been gleeful about the civilian casualties. Have you seen all the memes like, if you don't want to get killed, don't keep hostages in your house? You don't keep, there's been a lot of mockery from the pro-Israel side. And my friend Omar Badar, the Palestinian American analyst, who I know you've interviewed as well, he made this point, I think on CNN, where he said, the only way you get to a consistent position is if you say that the Palestinians are allowed to go into Israel and kill 200 Israelis to get back 4 Palestinian arbitrarily detained detainees who are being tortured in an Israeli dungeon. Would anyone agree to that ratio? Of course not. We would say it was a horrific war crime. People would lose their minds. This idea that, you're in a civilian area, so we can kill all of you. As people have pointed out, the Israeli Defense Ministry is in the middle of a very huge civilian area in Tel Aviv. Does that mean that people can go in and bomb those streets and kill all the civilians? No, of course it doesn't. But we've become gleeful in our response to the deaths of, loads of unnamed Palestinians, unpeople, as the phrase goes. And this goes back years, doesn't it, Owen? You go back to 2014 and Protective Edge, the last Gaza bombardment by the Israelis. I think the death ratio was something like, if you believe the Israeli numbers, it was like 300 to 1. If you believe the Palestinian numbers, are more like 1,000 to 1. There's always been this massive discrepancy in civilian casualties, and we've just accepted it. We've just normalized it. And to go back to what you said at the start, the pro-Israel side says, well, what would you do instead? What do Owen and Mehdi want to do? Leave the hostages there? No, we want them out in a deal. And you mentioned the deal last November, as 105 Israeli hostages were freed without the massacre of Palestinians. Some of us, you and I and many others, want to do that again. There are still 120 hostages left in Gaza. And I interviewed Owen this week on Mehdi Unfiltered, the nephew of an Israeli hostage, Avraham Munda, who's 79 years old, poor man, still stuck in captivity, had his 79th birthday under Hamas captivity, a crime, a tragedy. And his nephew, Zeteo, told me on the show this week, he made a very good point. He said, look, total, the Israelis have freed 7 hostages, 7 through military means. He goes, by that ratio, it would take 10 years to free 120 hostages still in captivity. Well, it just doesn't even make sense. Like as a method of freeing them, instead of freeing 120 en masse, which is what we did last November when we freed 105 en masse through a deal. So it doesn't even make, if you really care about the hostages, you would want a deal that gets 120 out, not a ratio of 1 hostage freed per month by the Israeli military, which is what we have so far.
Well, I mean, let's be brutal. It's worse than that. I mean, look, firstly, we know the 3 Israeli hostages who were killed waving a white flag and yelling in Hebrew for their lives back in December. That horror underlined that if that was going to happen to Israeli hostages, what hope for Palestinian civilians? Yes. That was just a case in point. It shouldn't need stating, given all the evidence we know about what's happened to tens of thousands of slaughtered Palestinian civilians. But we also know there's huge evidence to suggest far more hostages have been killed on top of that by Israeli missiles as well. And the point is, in a practical sense, we care about the hostages' welfare more than these people, because we support a deal to actually get them out and get them home. And the net consequence, and this isn't being remarked upon enough, of this operation is to make it more likely more hostages are going to be killed. Yes. Because what it's done is added a kind of triumphalism and it added a sudden, because at the moment the Israeli state has been so, it's lost the propaganda war because of its genocidal rampage. Even its main patron is getting wobbly. Public opinion in the West has decisively turned against it. It's got requests for arrest warrants against its leadership, and it's just grabbed onto this as a life raft. That's what this has become, and it's incentivizing it to not do a hostage deal, but to continue this approach, which will mean more slaughtered hostages. And the other point, the point you make there about the glee, one of the ways that Palestinians have long been dehumanized is this idea that they take glee, they love in the killing of Israelis. That exactly a death call. But we already knew, I mean, it went back to, remember, you mentioned the 2014 Gaza war. Do you remember when you had some, and I'm not saying this to impose the same levels of collective guilt. I'm just saying you could say like and like. Israelis around Sderot watching Gaza being bombed.
They called it the Sderot cinema. They sat at night time on a hilltop watching bombs drop.
And then on TikTok, where you get this, dressing up as pretending to be starving Palestinians and boasting about how much water they've got and how much food's in their fridge.
No, it's true. Do we apply that standard in reverse and say they're all legitimate targets? Of course not.
All the Israeli soldiers who keep posting their war crimes on TikTok and all the rest of it. So I just think this whole just exposes the level of dehumanization. The other point is, I mean, if we're talking about prisoners or hostages, people who are detained, I was so disturbed reading this New York Times piece, which actually detailed finally, because the New York Times occasionally has bits of good journalism, but doesn't make up for its overall failures. Well, you read to the bottom and then you find just casually thrown in Palestinian detainees, men being raped, including raped to death with metal rods.
Yeah.
Where's the outrage? Where's the outrage?
And I got attacked for calling them Palestinian hostages. Many of them are hostages because they're taken as bargaining chips. They're not charged with any crimes. There are children in detention who are not charged with any crimes. So they're not prisoners. They're not convicts. They are quote unquote detainees. And there's no outrage. And we want a deal to get Palestinians freed and Israelis freed. That is a good thing. And again, to quote the nephew of this hostage, Avraham Munda, what he said to me this week, Owen, was so stark. He said, did you notice how Netanyahu turned up to meet with the 4 hostages who were freed in this raid? He didn't turn up to meet any of the 105 hostages who were freed in November, because that's not a good look for him. Hostages being freed by a deal doesn't make him look good to his far-right violent base. Hostages freed by the Israeli military who massacred Palestinians in the process, that's a great look for Netanyahu, the man who the ICC chief prosecutor wants to see in handcuffs. So that speaks volumes. And you mentioned the media. Let's talk about the media. Let's talk about the coverage of all of this, because Joe Biden claims that there is a deal on the table to get the hostages out, to get a permanent ceasefire. That's a very important phrase, the phrase of the week, permanent ceasefire. I think anyone with a brain and any command of the English language knows what that means. It means you stop fighting and it's permanent. It's not just for a few days. The Israelis keep saying we don't agree to this deal. The ambassador to the UN went to his counterpart, the Israeli ambassador, said, no, we don't agree to change the words to a temporary cessation of hostilities. Again and again, Netanyahu says non-starter that we end the war without destroying Hamas. Meanwhile, the American government and the American media keep saying that the Israelis have signed up to this deal. Oh, and I don't know about you, but while I've counted down the days to chat with you, and I've been excited about this call, the other thing I've been doing is tearing out my hair and losing my mind at the level of gaslighting, like Trump-level gaslighting from the Biden administration, from Antony Blinken, who just go out on TV and go, Hamas hasn't agreed to the deal, Israel has, which is a complete reverse of the reality. Do they think we just don't have eyes, ears, and internet connection?
Well, that's the thing, because it's always been the Israeli strategy to gaslight people to death, basically, as you suggested. Don't believe your lying eyes. Don't believe your lying ears. Turn reality on its head. Even though you know what you've read, you've seen, it's not true, and we're going to invert reality. And, Donald Trump was often rightly denounced for doing just that. It's something which was often said, it was the Putin playbook, where you get the Russian propaganda offensive, where you just say blatant lies, and they're so blatant and you keep saying them that you basically disorientate your opposition, because they just how do you even respond when you're up against that level of wanton dishonesty and without screaming, that's not true, that's not true. I mean, we know that Hamas accepted a deal which would have involved a staged prisoner exchange, and then a permanent ceasefire, that Israel publicly rejected it. We then know Joe Biden declared he had an Israeli proposal, which was exactly the same, and which then was disavowed repeatedly by Israel. And now we're repeatedly told that the real roadblock is Hamas not accepting it, even though they already did, and Israel has backed it.
Well, just to be particularly correct, just to be very, very fair, Hamas have said we welcome it, right? They said we welcome it, we want to talk about it, we're open to negotiations. It's the Israelis who've said, yeah, we're not happy with this text. And what's made me go mad is if I look at my Twitter, for example, where I spend a lot of time, as I know you do, I will see, for example, the US ambassador to the UN go, oh, they've accepted it, they just haven't done it publicly. And then I'll see the Israeli political coordinator at the UN, a woman who went on, I can't remember her name, a female diplomat from the Israelis. She sits in front of the Security Council and goes, we're carrying on the war till we destroy Hamas, which is not part of the deal. Then you look at another Blinken going, they've accepted the resolution. By the way, the resolution says in the text, I can't believe the UN Security Council signed off on this. Just a blatant lie. It says in the very top of the text, Israel has accepted this. There is zero evidence that Israel has accepted this. Netanyahu keeps saying, I am not stopping the war until I destroy Hamas, which is not part of Biden's deal. Biden's deal is Hamas are done now. You've done enough damage to them. We get a permanent ceasefire. The Israelis do not want a permanent ceasefire, which is fine. That''s their prerogative. But why are you lying to us and saying they do when they keep telling us they don't?
You're quite right. So you're exactly right. Because that was the deal Hamas essentially accepted. The stumbling block now is Israel keeps injecting that there will be a permanent ceasefire once we have achieved all of our war aims, which is
who is the ceasefire with? Who is the ceasefire with? If you've just
exactly. But that's exactly it. Obviously, there would be a ceasefire if they wiped out Hamas, and the point is that's not going to happen. I mean, I found
Israeli generals, by the way, say it's not going to happen.
Well, in Politico last month, you read this sometimes, and it actually makes me so angry, Mehdi. It makes me so angry because you got this briefing from US top intelligence people who presumably this is their life, this is their career, this is what they've been doing for decades. Suddenly speaking as though that this is a great revelation they've suddenly realized. And they go, well, actually, it turns out you can't just kill a load of, they've killed less than they said, than Hamas fighters than they think. But they said, there's also the fact that more people have joined Hamas since. Really? No shit. Yeah,
some of us were saying that, I think on October the 8th, that this will boost Hamas, or at least boost quote unquote resistance in the long run. You're not going to destroy the Palestinian right, ability, or desire to resist.
So all this means is Israel continues its genocidal rampage indefinitely. That's what it means in practice. So this idea that the real roadblock is, and none of this is to justify Hamas, it's just making the point that Israel has made it clear that they're not going to accept any deal which doesn't allow them to indefinitely carry on their genocidal assault until their impossible war aims are achieved.
Well, 2 points before we wrap up. One is indefinitely. It's not indefinite, Owen. It's actually till November, because Netanyahu is waiting for a change in presidency. He knows that as good as Joe Biden's been for him, and the reality is Biden's wrecked his presidency for Netanyahu, who doesn't even want a Biden second term. He wants a Trump second term. So it's coincidence that they keep saying, the Israelis, we just need a few more months. Oh, I wonder what happens in a few more months. And I would say one other thing. I know you've been very bothered. You keep reminding us, rightly so, that this is a genocidal assault. They are killing Palestinians. They are not just killing Hamas. This week, I know you got very upset, and rightly so, and talk our viewers through this, our listeners through. What did the Israeli government do online that basically gave the genocidal game away? I
mean, this obviously, genocidal intent has been from the very start very blatant. It's very rare for a state to make its intent so clear. And South Africa's document back in December had pages of genocidal intent and incitement from Israeli leaders. So, to be clear, this isn't simply a new piece of, this is the one piece of evidence. It's what I've seen in this context, but this is astonishing. The official Israeli account tweeted out, "We need to talk about the elephant in the room. Many Gazan civilians participated in the horrific events of October 7th. It is also reported that Gazan civilians held Israeli hostages captive in their homes. The world must condemn this in the strongest terms." And they had a video attached in which the narrator goes, and they put up in text, many Gaza civilians took part in killing, raping, looting.
There are no innocents.
Exactly. They include a quote from a hostage. She speaks in Hebrew, a former hostage. She says about Gaza, there were no innocent civilians there, which they chose to put in big letters. That is just blatant and very important. They didn't just tweet this out. They paid to make it an ad. They paid Elon Musk to project this tweet all over people's Twitter feeds, all over the world. And the point they were trying to do, is very clear what they were trying to do there. They were trying to say to Western audiences, those civilians that you're upset about being slaughtered, you shouldn't be, because they're not really innocent. These people are all in it. They're all Hamas. They're all murderers. I mean, even if you went by, just statistically what they're talking about, the number of civilians who took part in October 7th is a minuscule fraction of Gaza's population. Obviously, true civilians can commit war crimes. Israeli settlers are classed as civilians. They're committing war crimes in the West Bank. Anyone who commits war crimes needs to be prosecuted for doing so. But what Israel did there is make it clear the precondition of all genocides is collective guilt. This whole group, whoever they are, it doesn't matter if you class them as civilian or not, they're fair game, they're legitimate targets. And they deleted that tweet. And that itself is an admission of guilt. Because if I was at the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, you add that as a pretty important piece of evidence to pile.
Pretty sure that deleting the tweet doesn't stop prosecutors from adding that to their file. Sorry, Israel. The internet is forever. Owen Jones, we will have to leave it there. I'm Mehdi Hasan.
I'm Owen Jones, and we will see you in 2 weeks. And I will count down those days, minutes, seconds.
So will I, Owen. So will I. See you soon.
See you soon.